I have just returned from our choir and parish retreat at St. Mary's Seminary, Roman Catholic Seminary in Santa Barbara. And Reverend Brian O'Rourke is up there with them this morning, and I came back to be with all of you. They're still going strong. The choirs are rehearsing much of the music that they will be singing this fall and winter. And the retreat participants that aren't members of the choir have been spending time with a spiritual practice called Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is a particular way of reading Scripture, and it's an ancient practice that dates back to about the 3rd century. It's very different. It's a very different way of reading than how we have been taught to read. All of us were trained in school in one way or another to think critically, to not believe everything we read, to sort and to sift, to make judgment calls based on our own experience and knowledge and our own ability to reason. Now, this is a great way to read the paper or the warnings on a bottle of medicine. It's a great way to read what's coming up in this year's election. It's a great way to listen to the statements of the candidates. We need to be able to read and hear and think critically. It's essential. Lectio Divina is different. Its purpose is not to help us make well-informed decisions, but to draw us closer to the presence of God. Or perhaps a better way to describe it is that it's meant to draw our awareness to God's nearness to us always, to make us more aware of how God is always with us. When we read Scripture in that Lectio Divina style, we let the words wash over us. We let them sink into our ears and eventually into our hearts. And as we read, a word will strike us somehow, will be a little hook. And then at that point, we hang on to that word and keep it in our mind in some way. Let it sort of live inside us until something shifts and we are graced with a new perspective. In that moment, we begin to offer this perspective back to God, to pray with a new perspective, which ultimately leads to a sense of gratitude and a feeling of unity with the divine. I have a small example from this weekend. We read the first part of Jeremiah together, Jeremiah 1, 4 through 10, which is the call of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is called to be a prophet. And the word that really hooked me was the very last word, which was plant. And as I prayed with this word plant, I realized that the meaning of it for me was so varied. Like, we're planting a vineyard here. There's some actual physical planting going on. In my life, I'm planting myself in a community for the first time in my adult life. I've been pretty much nomadic. So, and that sense of call to be planted in a place was very profound for me. So that's the way Lectio Divina works. And you see how this is a really different way of reading than reading the paper. And I have a suspicion that many of you hear our readings every Sunday in this way, that you're actually practicing this you're doing this kind of spiritual practice as we read our lessons. I hear in conversations with you, you speak about what touched you in the reading, what caught your attention, and what it means in your life. And that's basically what Lectio Divina is. What is so beautiful and profound about Lectio Divina is the impact that it can have on a life and on a community. The experience and grace of praying with Scripture in this way doesn't just last for the moment of prayer, but it continues. It's like a seed that gets planted, and over time it grows, and you'll find, a few months later, oh, that's what that piece of Scripture was about. That's what was going on in my life. The Bishops' Committee has been doing this practice each time we get together, and we have often remarked in our meetings what a difference it makes. It's changing the way we vision ourselves and the work we as a community of faith are doing to bring God's love and peace in the world. It's quite profound. And this kind of profound experience of prayer with the intention of bringing God's love and peace into the world is something that our world is in sore need of. The murder of the ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, and several others in his group, I think hit many of us really hard this week. I know it did me. And we actually have a few people at Epiphany who know the family of Chris Stevens. The hatred and violence that caused this murder is not acceptable. And though I understand these murders to be much more complicated than simply being about an anti-Islamic video made in the U.S., the mass appeal of hate seems to be growing. So many in our world want to find who it is they hate, who they can blame, who they can point to as the bad guy, who they can make the them to our us. In all of this unrest and uproar of the past week, in light of the coming election, and after spending a weekend with members of our church engaged in this kind of prayer practice, which focuses on words, I am really struck by the power words hold. I was talking with Lori Burns on our way home from the retreat, and she mentioned taking the youth group to the Museum of Tolerance a few years back. And they had a tour guide, and the first thing that the tour guide said was words. Words are what brought on the Holocaust. Words are what made this violence possible. Words have power. In our readings today, we hear about this power. Teachers are warned to be careful. A teacher is one person who has the ability to affect an entire group of people. In the reading from James, he uses the example of the largest ships being steered by the smallest of rudders. So it is with teacher. One person can affect the largest group of people. James then continues to speak about the power of words and how difficult it is to keep our mouths under control. We say things that we shouldn't, things that are harmful and damaging to ourselves and to others. James says that wild animals can be tamed by us, but we cannot seem to tame our own mouths. And so much of the gospel lesson is about words too. Words that identify who Jesus is. Words that are kept secret, this identity of Jesus. Words that are spoken openly, Jesus talking about the way he's going to die. And then in the climatic moment of the gospel, words used by Peter to chastise Jesus for speaking about his death. And Jesus' profound words, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, what do you suppose that is about? Is Peter really Satan? I don't think so. But the words coming out of Peter's mouth are not the words of life and love. They are the words coming from a place of fear and anxiety, words coming from a place that is very much in need of faith. Jesus speaks the truth here. Get behind me, Satan. It is words like these of Peter's that we are all prey to. All of us speak words that are not the words of life and love, but words that come from a place of our own fears and anxieties. And we all have fear and anxiety. It's part of what it means to be human. When we live in the presence of God, fear and anxiety has no place in us. And there's really no place for it to be, because we are held in this presence of divine love. Lectio Divina that we practice this weekend on our parish retreat, and that I think many of you do without even knowing it, is really a means to an end for us. And that end is learning how to live more deeply aware of the constant presence of divine love in our lives. In the practice of Lectio Divina, we let words take us deeper, take us to a place of this awareness of God. And from that place, the words that we speak will be words of life and love. Words of fear, anxiety, hatred simply have no place in us. when we are alive in the awareness of God.